Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to Sree's daily global COVID-19 show. My name is Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this global gathering and conversation about various aspects of COVID-19 and the crisis we're undergoing right now. Today, we have a very special show, and we want you to share this with your friends, family, colleagues around the world. Please tag, please hit share, please retweet. We're live right now on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Please share right now. My email address is sree@sree.net, SREE@sree.net. We are live in conjunction and partnership with scroll.in, one of India's leading news, culture, and analysis websites. And they have more than 2 million followers on social, and we're live on their channels as well. Please do follow scroll_in on Twitter. So let's tell you who we have today on the show. We have such an exciting program. We're going to be talking all about Shakespeare and pandemics. We're going to be joined by Professor Emma Smith, who is Shakespeare Studies Scholar at Oxford, and Professor Carol Rutter, who is Shakespeare Studies Scholar at the University of Warwick. And to help me host the show is Linda Bernstein, social media consultant, and who herself has a PhD in English literature and is a professor at LIU, Long Island University's Brooklyn campus. So we are going to be both in the US and in England at the same time. Folks, if you're watching, tell us where you're watching from. Please tag your friends. Please hit share right now. Before we bring on our speakers, we're so excited about this show. Before we bring them on, let's just tell you about our sponsors. And we are very grateful to Nidhi Sinha, who's a friend of the show, who has put in an ad for ProPublica. She says, congrats to ProPublica on its latest Pulitzer Prize that makes 6 in 12 years. Journalism that holds the powerful accountable. Support ProPublica at a time when deep dive journalism is most needed. Donate today, propublica.org, and congrats to ProPublica and its local reporting partner, Anchorage Daily News, for winning this Pulitzer Prize. We're also grateful to our sponsor, Pratham USA. You can double your donation right now by having it matched by going to prathamusa.org so that you can support its RISE, or Responsive Innovation to Sustain Education campaign in India. No more important topic in the world than how we educate our children. And in countries like India, it makes a big difference, the support that you can give. prathamusa.org. Please donate today. We are very grateful to all of you for being here, for sharing this out into the world. And let me bring on our 3 speakers who are going to be with us for the next 45 minutes or an hour. We want your questions. We want your comments. Let's see where people are watching from. My father is watching from India, and we'll tell you about him in a minute. Jonathan's watching from the East Village, and he says, if I be alive in your mind and your dinner worth the eating, which is Shakespearean for greetings from the East Village. And Linda, who is our co-host, is putting in links for Professor Emma Smith's new book, This is Shakespeare. And Soumya says, today's topic seems interesting, excited to hear about it. Tell us where you're watching from, folks, so that our guests know as well. And Tim Sohn is watching from Pennsylvania. Yes, folks, we are about to show you 2 of the greatest experts on Shakespeare. They're going to share with us their thoughts on Shakespeare and pandemic. So if we're ready, let's get started. And let me bring on stage right now our guests. I'll say hi to Carol Rutter. Hi, Carol. Emma Smith.
Hi, Sree.
And Linda Bernstein.
Hi.
So the 2 people on the top there are in the colonies, the former colonies of the United States. And we're talking to the mothership and the original colonizers, former colonizers. But we're just so happy to have all of us together in this setting, talking to the world. So we'll start the show the way we start every show, asking Carol and Emma, please tell us how you're doing, how your families are, and what's happening. So Carol, over to you first.
Over to me. Well, I'm sitting in a beautiful Warwickshire, April has been absolutely glorious in the countryside. The bluebells have been blooming. The lilac has just come and gone. The daffodils have been extraordinary. So if there is a message from God to us in all of this, it is about holding precious the environment around us as we deal with our human problems, and to put them into the perspective of a very long view on the face of this planet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's see what Professor Emma Smith at the University of Oxford has to say.
Hi, well, I'm lucky too. Everybody is well. We're in lockdown in a very strange, empty Oxford. A wonderful time to see the buildings and the kind of colleges and everything, if only we were able to. So it's a strange time. Our students should have just been coming back to start the summer term, what we call Trinity term. That's all gone online, and that feels a very different place to be. But yeah, all safe, all well, and getting used to this strange new world we find ourselves in.
Thank you. And we'll talk also what's it like to be a professor in this time and how you're connecting with your students as well. Linda, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm in the New York Berkshires, where it is beautiful, but it's also unseasonably cold. And in fact, tonight to tomorrow morning, there's a big chance we're getting 1 to 3 inches of snow. But next week, it's supposed to start warming up. So that's really good. And it's just great to be here. And I'm so pleased that Emma and Carol agreed to join us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you'd like to get started, Linda, maybe to set the scene a little bit for us. And we'll also show folks the wonderful op-ed piece that was written by Professor Emma Smith. We'll show that as you set the scene, Linda.
Well, when the lockdown started, a huge internet meme went along the lines of, when Shakespeare was in quarantine, he wrote King Lear. What are you doing? And yeah, we all should be doing something. I don't know how many people alive would be capable of sitting down and watching King Lear. But then there in the New York Times was this wonderful column by Emma Smith about what Shakespeare teaches us about living with pandemics. And I'd like to start just by asking Emma a couple questions and like throwing it to her for a few minutes in there to answer those. And what about this meme that we were seeing all over Facebook, all over Instagram? You know, what are you doing? Shakespeare wrote King Lear. What do you make of that, Emma, both historically and as how people relate to Shakespeare? I mean, it does so show continued importance of Shakespeare in our consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. What I call WWSD, what would Shakespeare do? That's something we always kind of turn to, don't we? And we have done for centuries. So it's an interesting point. I think when it came up on Twitter, the idea that Shakespeare had written King Lear during lockdown, it was a slightly double-edged thing, I suppose, about the possibilities of productivity. And of course, we know that those possibilities of productivity are very privileged. It might not have been a coincidence that most likely Shakespeare was away from his family and his children in order to get this time to write. Shakespeare's writing King Lear in 1606, probably. The first performance is in the Christmas season at the end of that year. And there is a closed period in the summer, a plague closure of the theatres. The theatres close when London deaths reach, it changes, but about 30 deaths a week. And so we do see a connection between plague time and the writing of King Lear, but it's not absolutely definite. But the plague is a feature of Shakespeare's working life. It's a feature of Elizabethan urban life. Everybody was if not used to, at least reasonably familiar with these periods, particularly in the summer and autumn of plague outbreaks. And I guess Shakespeare probably did just find ways of working on through them, just like we all are now. What's striking, though, about that work is he never talks directly about the plague. There are some contemporary writers who really engage with the plague and what's happening, and the kind of urban life, and the awful experience, the awful sort of dark comedy of the whole thing. And I know Carol and I'll be chatting about those later on. Ben
Emma,
Johnson, who's the...
Can I just ask you,
Yeah, sure,
about plague was in something that Shakespeare lived through just once. It wasn't a one-time thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the Stratford-upon-Avon church registers say that show that the plague comes to Stratford just within a few weeks of Shakespeare's birth. So as a child, he survives outbreaks of plague. When he first, early in his time working in London in 1592 to 3, there are closures for plague again about 10 years later. So this is a reasonably common occurrence, and plague mortality in some ways then was pretty much as it is now. It was harder on poor people. It was harder on people who were living in poor conditions, and Shakespeare seems to have been able to negotiate around that.
Well, Emma, you also, you say something in the piece that was published in the New York Times. It was a line I really loved. It was, the plague is, I'm looking for this exactly, the plague is everywhere and nowhere in his works. Can you talk more about that, Emma? I mean, you go through some really interesting points in your piece about the kinds of deaths Shakespeare talks about, and where the plague might fit into how we look at his opus.
So there's a couple of ways. I mean, one is that the language of plague, or cursing people with plague, that's everywhere in Shakespeare's writing. You might remember Mercutio saying famously in Romeo and Juliet, "A plague on both your houses." That's lost some of its energy, some of its edge for us, but that must have had a different kind of edge in an age which understood what it meant if plague came and visited your house. So the language of Shakespeare is steeped in references to plague, but in all the plays, nobody gets the plague, nobody dies of the plague. Shakespeare's not, in fact, a documentary writer, and he writes relatively little directly about the London of his own time. And instead, I think he sort of transforms. One of the worries about plague is that the number of deaths mean that death loses its individuality, it loses its importance. And I think what Shakespeare's tragedies do is to give that importance back. They don't stop people from dying, quite the opposite. They kill off lots of people, don't they? But they give those deaths meaning and importance, and they're a counter in that way to the sort of mass grave iconography, which is such a fearful thing, isn't it, about plagues past and present. The idea that you won't have a proper funeral, or the idea that people won't be there at your dying moment, that's come back to us as such a powerful loss, and that's something I think Shakespeare's plays do counter. And that seems to me one of the ways an imaginative writer, rather than a documentary writer, might respond to the plague.
So before we get Carol into the conversation, we just want to show you the global nature of this conversation. We know Shakespeare is global. Everyone who's watching, please tag your friends. Please hit share. There's somebody in your life who loves Shakespeare who should be watching. Let's see, Sumit is watching from New Delhi in India. Laurie's watching from Westchester and Dobbs Ferry. Maitrey is also in Dobbs Ferry. Ajay is watching from Oklahoma, which is great. Chavi is ready for the show. Samya says she's ready as well. Tuba's watching from Bihar. Anand's watching from Andhra Pradesh. So there's just people from all over the world. Clara's watching from Torino in Italy. Super excited to watch and learn more about Shakespeare. Italy, of course, figures in multiple Shakespearean plays. And one of the things I want to just ask Carol before we get into this, Carol, how much did Shakespeare travel outside of England?
He didn't. He read. He read enormously. He wouldn't have been able to afford to travel. Travel was very, very expensive unless you had a patron, unless he had been going in the service of somebody on some kind of low-level ambassadorial or courtly visit somewhere in attendance with a patron. But otherwise, it would have been just far beyond his means. He didn't have, an independent income. He had to work, and he had to work in the theatre on a daily basis as a player. We need to remember that Shakespeare made his money on the stage, playing the works of Shakespeare and Johnson and Dekker and Chettle and so on. He didn't make his money as a playwright.
Wow, that's so important to remember. Linda, over to you.
Yes, Carol, when I was speaking to you yesterday, you brought up an interesting point. You said that his play, Measure for Measure, is actually maybe the play that reflects the plague and his life. Can you elaborate on that a bit, Carol?
Yes, because what Emma was talking about in terms of 1606 and the writing of King Lear may or may not be the case that he was writing King Lear during that particular very short and not terribly fateful plague period. But the place that we do know that there was an extraordinary visitation of the plague was between 1603 and 1604. And in that year alone, something between 40 and 60,000 Londoners out of a population of 120,000 died. The playhouses were closed from February 1603, just at the point at which Queen Elizabeth was now actually on the point of dying. So the playhouses were closed. King James, miraculously, without any civic disturbance, came to the throne to be her heir. He arrived in London in April, May, coming down from Scotland. And just about the time that he entered London, the first notice of plague breaking out in London happened. And over that year, week by week by week, the plague bills rose in mortality figures until we were getting to the point of having 1,800 people a week dying in London. And it's what Thomas Dekker writes about in his book called The Wonderful Year. Wonderful, full of wonders, because it was about the death of the Queen, then the coming to the throne, the accession of King James, but then the beginning of this appalling plague. So for 22 months, the playhouses were closed. And it doesn't look like Shakespeare wrote a new play in all of that time. Shakespeare, throughout his career, wrote 2 plays a year. And in this period, he wrote practically nothing until he came to 2 plays that were on the stage where they played before the king in November of 1604. So they must have been written in the 3 or 4 months before that. One of them was Othello, and the other one was Measure for Measure. Both of those plays significantly reference the plague. So Iago, for example, right at the beginning of Othello, says to Rodrigo when they're bellowing underneath the window to rouse Brabantio from sleep, he says, "Oh, here's a great idea. If he in a fertile climate dwell, plague him with flies." That turned his whole environment into filth, degradation, and sickness. And in what I was speaking to you about yesterday was, I think that Measure for Measure is his plague play, there's probably good reason why he would not have put a direct representation of the play on the stage, not just because he wasn't a documentary writer, but because all of his plays had to be approved by the censor. And I would guess, just like today, where people are in the beginning of Plague, very apprehensive about how we're representing the politics of the moment, it probably would have been difficult for Shakespeare to get a genuine Plague play past the censors at that moment. So in Measure for Measure, he's writing about a city that's in a kind of lockdown. There have been orders for a cleanup across the city to replace law and order that have fallen into abeyance. And the operation there, the cleanup there, has to do with sex crime. Basically, it has to do with sex crime. And there it seems to me that Shakespeare is doing a displacement activity, and he's looking at the other local plague that is also now endemic to England, which is syphilis, and thinking about the role of death and disease and human love in a way that makes it very, very complicated to think about a time of plague, which is also connected to love, marriage, romance, and the hard facts of law and order, and civic responsibility.
We just want to welcome everybody who's watching. What a great conversation. And we're just going to put on screen some of the wonderful comments we've gotten. Beth says, this is so interesting. Thank you. Tuning in as I work from my home outside Boston. Kavita says, love Shakespeare. We'll miss Central Park Shakespeare concerts in this pandemic. Many of you who are watching know about the famous Shakespeare in the Park. Incredible concerts, plays, performances that are put on every year by the Public Theater. Ajay says, very illuminating, watching from Oklahoma. Anand says, sharing this, indeed a good discussion. Yes, please, everybody, share with your family, friends, tag, just hit share or retweet right now. We're live on multiple platforms. We want your friends to see this and to hear this conversation. Kavita says, it's so encouraging living with pandemics. And Tim, who is the Shakespeare CEO, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust CEO.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
He's Tim Cook with an E. He's watching from Stratford upon Avon, and he was very wonderful in discussing the role of Shakespeare and the role of Stratford in the imagination of both Shakespeare and the world Shakespearean community, because this year is Shakespeare's 456th birthday, 456, it will never happen again. And unfortunately, the Stratford annual parade was canceled. And so we put together an online celebration that you can all go back and watch. It's in the comments of the Facebook post, so you can see in the description, you can watch the Salute to Stratford, as it was called. And Tim, we even had the mayor of Stratford and the vicar of the church where he's buried and the headmaster of the school he went to. It was what I call a life highlight. We have so many more comments coming in and just getting people. Andy's watching from Toronto, and Antu is tagging a friend, and people are giving us their favorite Shakespearean lines. Let's do that. Let's hear your favorite lines, favorite sonnets, favorite plays, and also any movies that you like about Shakespeare. And here's one from Andy. It says, look, he's winding up the wit of his watch. By and by it will strike. And you're seeing that. What would Shakespeare do is what one of you said, and Saurabh is putting that on the screen. And Lori says, I watched the show you hosted from Shakespeare's hometown. That was great. And Vandana is one of our two amazing producers, Vandana_Menon on Twitter. And she's posted a link to Emma's article as well. And Rose Horowitz is our other producer. They're both live tweeting. Rose Horowitz, 31. Please do check them out. So back to Linda.
Yeah, but talking about going back a bit to Emma's article and about the way people die in Shakespeare, Emma, you said something really well. You listed a bunch of the deaths, notable deaths in Shakespeare's plays, and had what was a droll line, and Ophelia drowns, as if she just drowns. But one thing you also point out is that in Shakespeare's plays, people often get to have these wonderful speeches before they die. And it seems that that is such a contrast with the reality of death. And yes, Shakespeare's not a documentary writer, but what do you make of the death speeches? Why do you think those are so important, Emma?
It's true that in Shakespeare's tragedies, the moment of death seems like the high point, even the kind of triumph, almost a sort of perverse triumph. And so for main characters, it's often a moment where they get a chance to speak uninterrupted, sometimes rather implausibly, having had their death wound delivered them, or being close to death, but nevertheless they're still able to crank out a few more pentameters in a kind of wonderful speech. For me, I think these are moments where we focus and we notice, and we watch the immediate process by which characters understand their own lives and then are eulogized by the people around them. So these are important acknowledgements of the strangely life-affirming quality, perhaps, of Shakespeare's tragedies. Never mind that they're so full of people dying, and that too, the kind of life-affirming quality of Shakespeare's work, the importance that he gives to individuals. I think that is a kind of antidote to plague and to fears about mortality and erasure.
Yes, it's often interesting that how much people talk right before they die, and how this is carried over into other versions of the Shakespeare plays. For instance, in Prokofiev's music for the ballet of Romeo and Juliet, there's this whole set piece. I mean, Mercutio has already been stabbed, and he does it's there in Prokofiev's music. So no matter who choreographs to it, there are these wonderful steps Mercutio is making while he is dying. So it's just incredible how this has just translated into the different media which we now see, the different art forms which we now see Shakespeare's plays on stage or in music. So you to go to Carol for a minute. Carol, you had.
Can I add to that? Could I?
Yeah, please.
Talking about is to remind us how many times people die by their words just running out. So Mercutio actually is taken off stage to die. He doesn't get his big death speech. Hotspur dies running out of words, and it's Hal who has to finish his death speech for him. Likewise, Cleopatra, she dies on the half line. The words just run out. And poor old Mark Antony keeps trying to give his big death speech, and she won't let him do it. She keeps saying, no, don't you talk, I'll speak. And it's almost as though if she speaks and refuses to allow him to have that speech, he can't die. Equally, it seems to me that the death speech that is never given. I mean, Emma, in her wonderful piece, New York piece, was talking about, or was noticing that people aren't dumped into mass graves. And in some respects, that's a very positive way of looking at the deaths across Shakespeare, because, of course, many people are dumped into the mass grave. And I'm thinking here specifically of, say, Falstaff. Falstaff, when he's leading his ragbag troops, he's misused the king's press damnably. He has taken money from all the men who don't want to be pressed. So he's taken people out of prison. He's taken people who are rogues and vagabonds. He's put them into military, well, not even to military uniform. He's taking them off to Shrewsbury. And Prince Hal stops him in the road and he says, "My God, whose soldiers are those?" And Falstaff turns around and says, food for toss, fill a pit as well as other. And when we see him the next, he's saying basically these 150 men whom we never see, they're kind of over there someplace. Those 150 men who are referred to in two scenes later, only 3 of them are alive. So 147 men have gone into a mass grave, and where we find them in Shakespeare most of the time, of course, are on battlefields across all of those history plays, or indeed in Coriolanus, where Coriolanus has such contempt for the plebs, and it's really a patrician view that gets the big death speech. So it's just kind of complicating that idea of when words run out, when people aren't allowed to have their final speech, where they do get their big final speech, and always to remember, I suppose, because my area of specialism is in performance. I spend a lot of time thinking about performance, and one of the things, of course, that Shakespeare never does is ever to speak himself through the plays. He speaks, or the characters speak, and the wonderful aspect of theater is that you can say this and that simultaneously on the stage. So whatever we can take that is positive as a comment, we also then immediately get somebody speaking the opposite of that.
Well, folks, I just want to remind everyone we're about halfway through this conversation. We're so blessed to have both Carol Rutter and Emma Smith here with us, and Linda Bernstein, as we talk about Shakespeare, with questions and comments coming in from around the world. If you are liking what you're seeing here, please hit share, please tag, please invite your friends to watch now or later. That's the beauty of this. As soon as we're done, it'll run again. But you can also find all our conversations. This is a daily show where we talk about various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can go to my YouTube channel. Sreenet is my YouTube channel, and @Sree is my Twitter handle. But please subscribe on our YouTube channel. That's the best way to keep abreast of all the shows that we're doing. And if you like this, if you like what we're doing here, we also invite you to please think about having your own show. Our company, DigiMentors, builds these shows for other folks. Very easy for you to have your own virtual live web show. We're working with amazing places like the University of Hong Kong, and we're also doing virtual events for places like Princeton University, as well as live shows for individuals. So if you know anyone who would like a virtual event, please reach out to us. Please talk to me. Sree@sree.net is my email address, sree@sree.net. You see it right there. And we're so grateful to Professors Emma Smith and Professor Carol Rutter and Professor Linda Bernstein for being here. I'm going to bring them back on stage. Just wanted to give them a moment to stretch and relax. It's so hard to do these, when you're sitting in these online calls. And the first question I want to ask that has come, a very good question that's being asked by Ghanshyam, who says, I was wondering how to study Shakespeare by oneself, the tragedies especially. So let's bring in our panel again. And who would like to tackle that first?
I'll go.
Yeah, okay.
Read them out loud. Read them out loud. Read the plays out loud. If you're doing them all by yourself, get up and walk around the room as if you were holding a script in your hand and read out loud.
How about you, Professor?
I think that's great, really great advice. There is plenty of kind of support material for you. You can listen to other people reading them. You can watch clips of movies and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think reading and pushing through what seems immediately difficult. There are aspects of Shakespeare's language which are really, really straightforward and really hit us with a kind of punch now, as they did probably 400 years ago. And there are bits which are like poetry. They don't give up what they mean easily. And part of their value is that they are dense and require us to work with them. And then there are some things which actually nobody understands, but we just have to get the gist. Of, we have to get the gist. Is this person angry? Is this person telling the truth? Is this person frightened? Happy? What do you get? And you really do get that if you read it. And so read like read like no one's listening. Read like no one's listening. Like dance like no one's watching. Yeah,
I love that. And we're going to talk about Professor Smith's book in a bit. Her book is called This is Shakespeare. It's brand new, just came out in the middle of all of this. This is the book that we have at home. A very light read here, the Yale Shakespeare, and this is the nice back of the book that they have. And this just reminds us of how daunting it can seem, but you're saying it can also be accessible. and that's important. Let's go with some of the the other comments coming in. Abu Baker says he's watching. Madhulika says, do you think it's easier to be played on a pipe? Call me what instrument you will, though you can fret me, yet you cannot play upon me. Hello from India. So nice to see all these folks jumping in here. Olinda is watching in Mumbai. And by the way, if any of you have a Shakespearean first name that you were given by your family, I'd love to hear if there's anyone named Romeo who's watching, or anyone named Juliet. What has your life been like to be named Ophelia, for example? We would love to hear from people like that as well. And here's someone whose account says, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? And I think that's also a very nice line. And my dad, who's watching from India, says, plays are to be seen on the stage, not to read, he says. And then he asks if you have found any Shakespearean advice to comfort the world today. So while you're thinking about that, I just want to tell everyone why this Indian American sitting in New York City, born in Japan, has such a such much love for Shakespeare. It's because my father, whose face you see there, he grew up in a village in Kerala in India with the level of Shakespearean technology, no indoor plumbing, no electricity. And he grew up in that house and grew up to be a Shakespearean scholar before he became an ambassador. And this is his autobiography. It's called Words, 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 which of course our guests know by heart. It's a line from Hamlet where Polonius says, what do you read, my lord? And Hamlet says, words, 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 act 2, scene 2, from that. And so my dad, I want to say to him, thank you for instilling this love of Shakespeare in me. At the age of 9, he took me to Stratford, where I got to see not just the wonder of Stratford for myself as a little boy, but also to see him visiting Stratford for the first time. And then 35 years later, I got to go back and do some workshops in Stratford and to do some work with both Stratford Birthplace Trust as well as the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was an incredibly moving thing. So before you answer his question, first, Professor Carroll, what is this interest that people have about Shakespeare all over the world, especially in countries like India?
Well, there's a historic reason why he was important to India, and that was because the colonial government, when the British in the Raj, required Shakespeare to be read as part of the Indian civil service exams. So he was located politically and as part of a way of educating Indians into a place in the civil service. Okay, part of the colonialist project. Why is he important? I suppose because globally, because he's so flexible. And that's because on the one hand, he is entirely specific to his own place and time. But in that specificity, he allows us also in the project that is central to what he's doing of becoming other, which is what a playwright does. And this is why your father's comment is, we need to see these plays performed, not read. I was just speaking that moment ago to the young man or young woman who was asking, how do I study Shakespeare on my own? And I was saying, read, because then you're actually performing to yourself. In becoming other, Shakespeare gives so many of us words to become others that allow us to experiment with all kinds of experiences that are beyond our lives, but that help us, equip us to live our lives. Again, I was thinking about the number of times I've done death. I have lots and lots and lots. I have thousands of deaths in my active memory, part of my muscle memory, because I have been through them in performance and in reading with Shakespeare. So he has built up for me a whole reference of how to deal with death, how to deal with pain, how to deal with loss, how to deal with love, and how to deal with, how also to deal with the good stuff about, being an absolute buffoon, or the word that the wonderful word that Emma used in her piece, the cussedness of life. He gives us an apparatus for becoming those other things. And I think it's that flexibility, that performativity that crosses boundaries that enables him to be useful globally.
Thank you. Professor Smith, if you can talk about that question my dad asks, what is some Shakespearean advice for today?
Do you know, Shakespeare, one of the things that, to pick up what Carol's just talking about Shakespeare's flexibility, and a point she made earlier about we could always find the opposite, we can always find the other kind of point of view. That makes Shakespeare in some ways quite a difficult playwright to get advice from. Sometimes we find ourselves quoting a character who actually in context is not necessarily somebody we would want to align ourselves with. Well, one really famous example is when Polonius in Hamlet is giving advice to Laertes, his son, before he goes back to Paris, and he's got these, to thine own self be true, neither a borrower nor a lender be. You see these bits taken out, don't you, as bits of wisdom, tea towels, mugs, mouse mats. They feel as if they're very good advice to us, but I mean, Polonius is a twit, to use a kind of British term. He's giving kind of slightly tired old cliches, and quite often the children are mouthing along with him in performance and saying, "Oh, Dad's off again." So I think that there are difficulties sometimes in finding, in extracting advice from Shakespeare, but it's definitely something that people have always done, and actually counter with all respect to Sree Senior. People have always read Shakespeare's plays. The plays were being published for readers, really from really early on, and they've found ways of reading. And one of the things they seem to do in reading, this might be helpful for people who are thinking of reading at home, was to pick out the bits that they found helpful or interesting or good advice for life. They weren't necessarily reading for the plot in the way we might read a novel and think, "Oh, I wonder what happens next." But they were, a little bit more purposeful, perhaps, in reading ethically, or cherry picking out the bits that would help in their particular situation.
But I have a line for your dad, if it might serve. It comes from Henry VI, Part 2. Not a play that a lot of people read or see in the theatre. And it's when the Duke of Gloucester has watched his wife be outed in a plot. She has been disgraced. She has to walk through the streets of London with her treason on her chest, what she's done wrong on her chest. She has to go barefoot, and she has to be subject to the gaze of the masses through the streets of London. And he looks at his wife as he's standing by the side of the street, and he takes her by the hand and says, "The world may laugh again now." And I think it's a quiet comment, but the world may laugh again now does all right for me at this point.
Thank you so much. I'm sure my dad is so pleased to hear you talking to him directly. Here are some other comments that have come in. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. My dad contributes like flies to wanton boys. They kill us for their sport. We are to the gods, as he says. Amrit says, Shakespeare is timeless and his stage is the world and reflects the essential human nature. And I just think it's so nice. Gansham says, I love reading the text as in a play mode, and people are just posting from all over. So Linda, let's get some more questions. We have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Lots of questions and lots of answers also.
It's really funny because I'm going to shock your dad, Sree, and I'm going to really shock Carol. But I actually, though I see Shakespeare plays as much as I can, I actually prefer reading Shakespeare. As something about being able to have it in my hand and in my mind. But I'd like to direct this one at Emma, because there are lots of other writers that we aren't as familiar with, who really were writing more specifically about the plague. And it's someone that Carol and I discussed yesterday, and you mentioned in your New York Times article, Emma. Then that's Thomas Dekker, and Carol also I think has some the front pieces of his books that Sree showed before. Emma, why do you think it is that Shakespeare comes more to mind that so few people have even heard of Thomas Dekker.
Well, in some ways, this is the opposite of what Carol was saying about why Shakespeare is so global and so flexible, that on the one hand he's specific to his time, and on the other hand he has this extraordinary kind of freedom for people to imagine themselves into those plays and into those situations, and that's not true of all writers. It's not necessarily what all writers are working for. Dekker's pamphlet, The Wonderful Year, as Carol was saying, is about a very specific moment. It's trying to speak back to the city, something of its experience. It's more like a kind of proto newspaper or journal or blog, or those kinds of more ephemeral sorts of writing. I mean, they're fabulous texts. They shouldn't be ephemeral because they're full of this kind of writhing imagery and invention and humor, but they're much more closely connected. I tell you who might be a kind of midpoint between these, and that's Ben Jonson. Mm-hmm. So Jonson's play The Alchemist is set in a plague London. The master of the house has gone away to the country to try and keep away from urban plague. The servants are in charge of the house, and they have set up this scam, effectively, that they're going to perform alchemy. And these people come to the door. They want various things. They're all in search of things that they want. Some of them want to find a cure for the plague and think that they'll make their fortune if they can do that. But Jonson's got a very interesting parallel between being in the theatre, being in the playhouse, where you imagine, which is a kind of fantasy or wish fulfillment space, and this house in Blackfriars where The Alchemist takes place. So following what Carol said about Measure for Measure, I mean, I'd be really, when the theatres do reopen, when our own theatres do reopen, I'd be really looking forward to a Measure for Measure, but also an Alchemist. I think they could really reflect interestingly on our times.
Yeah.
Can I add a bit there? Is that there's a wonderful the play that Emma's talking about, The Alchemist, is a wonderful conceit, because of course the master has done what the Privy Council wants people to do, which is social distancing, get out of the city, get out of the Blackfriars, go to the country, evacuate the city. But while the servants are being left in charge, they're running this scam that is bringing all of these people into the house. So reversing precisely what the orders were from the Privy Council, to effectively do what we're doing today, which is to be socially distant from each other. And it was that aspect of the management of plague that I think is something that we really need to observe about how the civic authorities, the government, handled this matter, was by seeing that the contamination had to do with congestion, had to do with proximity, which is why they always immediately, the first thing they did was to close down the playhouses. The playhouses in early modern London were the biggest structures, the biggest architecture, second only to the cathedrals. So they brought together lots of people in close proximity, and these people were also people who were not necessarily of the elite. So they were bringing into the playhouses those clothes that may have been carrying the contaminated fleas and the flea eggs that were the part of spreading this disease. So again, it's just a really interesting irony that this play of Jonson so wonderfully exposes both sides of this desire to be making the buck, continuing to have an economy that's running and make gold, and this other thing about saving lives.
Can we just look through these images, and if you'll tell us what we're looking at, and both of you can comment as we do that, and we have about 5-7 minutes left.
Well, this is the frontispiece to The Wonderful Year, that just tells you what is going, what is actually in this little quarto, this little pamphlet. Interestingly, and this is it was just that what is also interesting there is that he has a sweetener. He tells you what's going on, and this is showed the picture of London during Sick of the Plague. But I'm also going to give you some merry stories at the end to cheer you up. So it's a kind of doing two things at once.
Marketing.
And this one I love because on the one hand, you have Lord Have Mercy on London. I Follow is the skeleton with the dart of death and the piles of dead bodies that are labeled "We Die." And the other, so he says the skeleton, I follow, we die. On the other side, we fly, but also you can see the men who are carrying pikes, the soldiers who are making sure that those people go back into confinement so that they don't distribute, they don't just infect vast numbers of people around. So keep out, lock down, stay safe.
Amazing.
That is so relevant to various countries now as we explore our different attitudes, or the governor's different attitudes towards what it means to be able to open up and when we should open up. So to me, that's just an extraordinary historical document. And Carol, go ahead.
What happened in the plague? Of course, as soon as there was plague in a house, the house was closed. It was closed down. It was shut up, and everybody remained inside. Plague, of course, bubonic plague is not something that transfers from person to person. It has to be transmitted through the flea, through the infection of the blood, through the flea. So there were many households where people were sick, and people lived in the households. But this particular document, it happens to be from the Venetian secretary who came in February, who arrived in London in February of 1603 to deliver a message to Queen Elizabeth from the Republic. Then when she died, he was marooned there by a diplomatic protocol and stayed in London for the entire following year until resident ambassadors could arrive from Venice. But he becomes the eyes and ears and the pen, writing home twice a week, telling the Venetians what's going on. And that little document was simply a note to John Florio, the translator of Montaigne, and one of the really interesting bridges from people like Ben Jonson and Shakespeare into the Venetian community. And he's writing to him just to say, thank you very much for taking care of me. But the address there is interesting because Florio is at Horsley, and Scaramelli is writing from Sunbury. He's traveling around behind the king, who has left London to avoid the plague. And the king is just going from hunting lodge to hunting lodge with all of these people traipsing after him, trying to get an audience, trying to get him to pay attention to the civic business. And one of the things that Scaramelli says, because he documents right from the beginning, from May of 1603, the number of plague deaths as they are relentlessly rising across the summer through to August, when he's talking about the fact that people, nobody is paying their bills because they expect to die. The treasury has no money in it. The city is without any kind of commerce. Everything is completely shut. There is no social provision for anybody. And this then goes through to all the way through the summer into the autumn, when Niccolo Molino comes as ambassador. And in December, Molino writes, there were still 3 weeks ago, there were still thousands of people dying. And now in December, nobody talks about the plague. It's as though it had never happened. So we might also look forward to that as a reaction to our own situation. Maybe in several months, we will look back at this and put it into a perspective.
Yeah, we just want to thank everybody who's watching right now. We're almost at the end. We have a few more comments that have come in. Please share, tag your friends so they can watch the recording of this. Simone's watching from Chicago and says, I'm so glad you guys, to hear you guys with my morning coffee. I've wondered before if it was a common theme across the plays that the male characters often, on learning about the death of their female love interest or wife, respond by saying, and I'm paraphrasing, I shall find another time to mourn her death.
Well, that's Lady Macbeth. That's Macbeth on Macbeth, on Lady Macbeth, and she should have died hereafter. Laertes is thinking about Ophelia very significantly when he hears of her death. That's his sister's death. I'm just thinking about other. Come on, Emma, help me here.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what about Brutus and the death of Portia.
Yeah. But he pretends it happened.
Yeah, that's right. But you're absolutely right that the paraphrase from Chicago is definitely Macbeth talking about hearing the death of the offstage death of Lady Macbeth.
Yeah.
Here is Tuba says, talking about the global appeal, is it just the language that the plays are read more as a dramatic poem than a work of stage, or is something else that connects? Is it the language? Is it the story? Maybe you can expand on that.
I think the global appeal of Shakespeare is often precisely not the language. I mean, we've definitely got the element that Carol already talked about, the way Shakespeare goes around the British Empire, like the English language. But elsewhere, outside those traditions, those language traditions, there's a very interesting adaptation and kind of recolonization of Shakespeare. And that's usually signaled by translation. Linguistic translation, but also kind of cultural translation, and therefore it's the characters, it's the dilemmas and the situations in which they find themselves, it's the plots which I think have travelled most widely.
Yeah, he's a great storyteller, but that's also the reason why he can be translated into other languages, because they don't have the Shakespearean language. They use him, they take him, they do, with Shakespeare, what Shakespeare did to Plutarch or with Plutarch. But I was also thinking of that famous Polish director who sympathized with us English, because he said to us, Shakespeare sounds so much better in the original, i.e. the Polish.
There are some great comments coming in. Enjoying the talk. Rose Horowitz says, fascinating discussion. Piles of dead bodies are labeled "we die" in what we DYE. Jonathan says, until now, how many spoke about the Spanish flu? That's a really good point. My children said they'd never heard of it until all of this happened. And just like the internet, we've been talking about Shakespeare and how he's modern today. We also have Shakespearean trolls, people who dislike elements of Shakespeare clearly, because this is Priam, who has several times, 3 different times, has said Shakespeare is overrated. Shakespeare is overrated. Each of these is a separate post, and then he said he never wrote an original play. We're not going to get into the fight over that, but just imagine.
That's beyond dispute. He never did write an original play. Now maybe parts of A Midsummer Night's Dream and parts of The Tempest.
I think we would probably, and in some ways, I think we would probably agree with Priam. I mean, there are a lot of historical circumstances have conspired to give Shakespeare this extraordinarily elevated position, and there are lots of cultural problems with that. Shakespeare takes up space on the stage, which one might argue should go to younger writers, to new writers, to writers from more diverse backgrounds. Shakespeare's doing a lot of cultural work for us in sort of meeting some of those cultural needs. So I'd love to have that conversation with Priam about Shakespeare being overrated, and I don't think we would completely disagree.
I would just say that my error was in saying you're right that he was not original, but I was getting into the fight of whether he wrote there are all these, as you well know better than anyone, the
authorship question.
The authorship question, which we don't, we'll come back and we'll have to do that.
Yeah,
we have time left.
Priam is absolutely right in suggesting that we require William Shakespeare to do so much cultural work for us, and sometimes it's just not the right cultural work.
I want to make the quick point though. When I watch movies or TV shows with my family and friends, I often say, well, this is going to happen. And I'm usually right. And they say, how do you know? And I say, well, I've read the Bible and I've read Shakespeare and there are no more stories. That's it. So
that's good. Joe Apio watching outside Atlanta says, out, damn Spot. Wish they had sanitizer back then. Or perhaps Lady Macbeth was simply shooing her dog Spot. And Priam says, Sanskrit playwrights were much superior than Shakespeare. And so we like seeing that. Norm says, exciting discussion. His son Julian is reading Macbeth now, written during quarantine. We have to check whether that was... if you go back, Norm, and watch the beginning of this, we discuss how much was actually written during quarantine, and not sure what one means by original. He's without a doubt our greatest writer, poet, and dramatist. A recreation is surely an art itself, though. And Gansham says, I think we're not talking of a person here when we say Shakespeare. It's a literary concept for me. And Norm says, Harold Bloom has a wonderful book called Shakespeare, Invention of the Human, which reminds me, we promised Emma that we would talk about her book very quickly since it's so new. It just came out in March of this year. And oh, look at that, you have the book there. So let's, Emma, tell us what's in the book. We are, in all my shows, when we have authors on, people immediately say, I'm going to go and buy it on Amazon right now. So tell us about the book, please.
Well, it's been a great discussion, and it wasn't really going to be a discussion about my book. That's not what we're doing. But this is Shakespeare. There are 20 plays that I talk about. I try to perhaps make them a bit fresher, give some new angles, and emphasize throughout that Shakespeare's plays, even when reading or when performing, they're incomplete, they're gappy, I say, and this gappiness, what Carol was talking about before as flexibility, this gappiness is a really great space for us to think in, to be creative in, to find ourselves or to kind of other ourselves in. So I hope it's a kind of invitation in a way to enjoy Shakespeare, particularly perhaps for people who found having to study Shakespeare and sort of, learn bits and feel they've got to decipher everything, have found that maybe crushed their enjoyment a little bit. I hope that this book will give some of that back.
I can't wait to read it. Before you go, I'd like to give you each a chance for a final comment or thought. And also, can you tell us your favorite Shakespearean work and also favorite adaptation of that work, either a particular version you saw on stage or a movie or a reading, any kind of recommendation that people can look up. So I'll start with Linda, then we'll go to Carol, and then we'll go to Emma. So start with Linda, your favorite Shakespearean work, and then the interpretation of any.
I mean, I have a couple. I really love The Tempest. I really love Hamlet. My favorite production of The Tempest was something I saw in Central Park many, many years ago, and I thought that it really caught the magic and the relationship between everybody and the whole idea of Miranda as this person who is just seeing human, like Brave New World, the halfless creatures in it. I just think it's a really optimistic play. My daughter's name is Ariel, but it's actually after the archangel and not Ariel, but people call her Ariel. So on to you, Emma.
I think we said Carol will go next.
Carol.
Yeah.
Oh, Carol next.
Well, I've just finished a book for Manchester University Press on Antony and Cleopatra that writes a 400-year performance history of the play. So starting in 1606 when the play was first performed. So I would have to say that I am coming out of a time of being so intimate with that play and so loving that play that my that I would have to signal as my favorite play. But when students ask me the question, and they always do, I have to answer them honestly. It's the play that I'm reading this week. It's the play I'm working on this week, because he captures you, he gets you, he comes up behind you and whacks you over the head with something new that you think, oh my God, I even though I've read this play 10, 20, 30, 40 times, that bit always, there's something always new. So it's a constant re-engagement with Shakespeare, I guess. It is my notion of the favorite. And because I'm somebody who watches a lot of Shakespeare, is in the theater a lot. It's very, very hard to isolate single performances. But if you want a way of looking at Shakespeare, I would go back to that wonderful film called Shakespeare in Love, the first, Shakespeare docudrama that tells you so much about William Shakespeare, and it just makes you laugh. And of course, it preps you for recognizing all of those, those quotations that you're going to come upon, later, and those great actors, and putting that against, I guess, Romeo plus Juliet, that version, the film version of Romeo and Juliet. That's not a bad place to start. And then when we get out of this lockdown, to get into the theater and start looking at players in the flesh doing their stuff, you know, just to get the Royal Shakespeare Company going again, get the National Theatre going again. When lockdown came, I happened to be in rehearsals as the academic consultant. That's with the RSC in a production of Phil Breen's of the Comedy of Errors that they had to stop. They just had to stop, and I'm hoping that gets back up on its feet because it's going to be brilliant when we get to see it. So there we go. The next play and the next production are always my favorite.
I just want to say two things to Carol on that. Number one, as a amateur Shakespearean lover, to hear one of the great scholars of the world say that Shakespeare in Love is one of the good ways to appreciate this, because I've been made fun of by being told it's too simplistic, it's too fake, but I loved the movie. Today, we look at it through the lens of the marketing campaign that Harvey Weinstein ran and all of that, but it's still the essence of that play and the movie about how it captures life also at that time. Yeah. And the plague features in this, right? The Master of Revels has to close the play.
That's right.
The house. And Judi Dench is only on screen for 10 minutes, but steals the whole movie. And the other thing is to hear from you, Carol, that you have been watching this you've been reading this for so long, and you still find it new. You find things anew in Shakespeare. It's wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's go to Emma Smith as she talks about both her favorite Shakespearean work and then interpretation of his work.
I so agree with Carol that whatever you're spending time with, Shakespeare really rewards you spending time. I think you do enjoy things more. You see more possibilities in it. I've been working quite a bit on Twelfth Night, which is a play I really love. I think it's a beautifully constructed comedy, but it looks quite different in the modern age. It's the story of a woman who wants to pass as a man for the rest of the play and never returns as a woman right at the end. That starts to look a little bit different in our sort of more genderqueer, more gender fluid kind of age. So it's been interesting to go back to that play. There are a couple of really great films of Twelfth Night. One by Trevor Nunn, which I really enjoy, which starts with a fantastic underwater sort of amniotic underwater sequence where the twins get separated. So yeah, I think that's what I'd recommend.
And in terms of the way you're working with this book now, I know it's hard to have a book come out in the middle of this. How are you getting it out there? What are you doing?
So you're absolutely right. The visit to the US, which I was really looking forward to, was going to be in the middle of April. So obviously that didn't happen. Quite a lot of stuff's gone online. It's been really fun to talk with people. You know, lots of Shakespearean communities, Shakespeare festivals in the US who are trying to keep connected with their audiences during this shutdown. It's been great to do some online things there and some bits and pieces of writing. But you know, there are worse things to lose, aren't there, in a pandemic than the chance of a glass of white wine and a book launch.
Do you know either of you if he was popular in early America, the timeline being because it was soon after, right? I mean, he was, in the 1700s or 1800s. Was he loved here? When did that Shakespearean love come to America?
Very early. He was taken over, with practically from the beginning, and by the time it gets to to independence and so on, he's being played all over. He's being played in the Wild West. There are some terrific books. One of my that are about Shakespeare in America, and indeed Jim Shapiro's new book is precisely about that, isn't it, Emma?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Shakespeare in a Divided America by James Shapiro. Let's plug someone else's book, also written in a pandemic. But Shapiro is a really great writer on what American politics, sort of left and right, has done with Shakespeare, and you'd enjoy it. He has a lovely bit on Shakespeare in Love.
Jim also has a wonderful book on the authorship the authorship question that actually takes it seriously and does a terrific job of thinking that one through for us. So yeah, Shakespeare's in America right from the beginning.
All right.
Certainly, when my father went as an immigrant, as a one of the books that those Welsh families had to take from the valleys with them was a copy of Dickens and a copy of William Shakespeare. So I have my grandfather's Shakespeare that he took to America with him.
Oh my God! Well, how wonderful is that? We just want to also say that Emma is on Twitter. She's at Old Fortunatus, and she uses Twitter, so that's great to give her a chance to follow her there. Please get her book as well, and they're both at university campuses. Emma is based at the University of Oxford. She's a fellow at Hertford College, and Carol Rutter is at University of Warwick. We're grateful to both of you. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see both of you in New York at some point, and we'll have a celebration and a feast to mark Shakespeare and us all getting back together.
And Sree, I want to see you in Stratford when we open up the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, when we explode those gardens, open our front doors, and welcome the world back to Stratford-upon-Avon.
Yes, thank you. I look forward to doing that. I have some housekeeping to do, so we will let you go. And thank you both very, very much. We're so grateful. There's so many great comments here. And thank you for giving me a dose of Shakespeare, says Mark. Kavita says, I love the movie Shakespeare in Love. And so many other comments coming in. And thanks, Carol, Linda, and Emma. What a nice morning wake-up call. And this is different times, of course, in different places. Thank you very much, both of you. We'll let you go.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Folks, I hope you enjoyed that. I want to tell you that we've just had an incredible opportunity to have both of them in with us. Carol Rutter and Emma Smith are two of the world's great experts on Shakespeare, and they were on our show, and they were with you. And so we're so blessed. And this is just an example of the generosity of the Shakespearean family of scholars who love talking about Shakespeare and given a chance, will share with you their thoughts and ideas. We are truly lucky that we are able to be here at a time when we can talk to folks like that. I hope you enjoyed it. I do want to show you my connection to Shakespeare in a way that you may not have expected. I do so much stuff around Shakespeare that I created a hashtag that I use called Shakespeare, where you can see here, this is my way of bringing together all my Shakespearean posts. And here you see for his 400th anniversary obit, it was written in the New York Times as if it was in 1616, as if the New York Times existed in 1616. We looked at a great Shakespearean scholar who passed away. We also, this is my dad's book, which we talked about Polonius. There's also Shakespeare Magazine. And 5 years ago, on my second visit to Stratford-upon-Avon, we tried twice to see Shakespeare's grave at Holy Trinity Church, and we were not able to get in. This is my daughter trying to pull at the door, and she can't get in. And that was twice when we were in Stratford that we couldn't get in. It was very, very sad. But then for Salute to Stratford, we got to interview the Reverend Paul Taylor, who is the vicar of Holy Trinity Church. There's just so much here that you can go look. There's the mayor, Kate Rolfe of Stratford. And we were able to also, in my business, we say good counselors lack no clients, but we do need to pitch to get those clients. So if you are looking for any work around digital or digital events, please do get in touch. This is our card that shows the kind of work we do. Please email me, Sree@Sree.net. Maybe you'd like your own live web show, live and recorded. You can get that if you contact us. Any event, if you know of any conference that's being canceled, get in touch with us so that we can help them rethink the cancellation or the postponement. There's no reason you can't think of doing that. Here, Shakespeare and Company, the bookstore coming back. A couple of years ago, it's back. Shakespeare wrote his best works during a plague. This was one of the articles. Here's some music from the 1300s, traditional English dance in Stratford that you're seeing here. And Shakespeare made up a lot of words. Look at this list that he made up and phrases. Too much of a good thing, one fell swoop, Olympian, unreal, eyeball. These are all words that are credited to Shakespeare. Frugal, you can see successful, bedazzled, trust a few, do wrong to none. These are all things that you know that came from him. There's more about my dad. This is my kids. And we couldn't find the two gentlemen of Verona, but so we settled for two tweens of Verona. This was 5 days on our way to Stratford. This is Linda posting about Professor Emma Smith's op-ed in the New York Times that we talked about. And here's a pie chart of all the causes of death in Shakespeare's plays that you can see. Drops dead. Number 1 is stabbed. And then you can see ripped apart by mob, blinded, drops dead. I don't know why I'm smiling as I read this, but it tells you something about the obsession Shakespeareans have with death, and as Shakespeare himself did. This is us dressed up in the Royal Shakespeare Company. You can go and then you can put on some outfits that are used in the plays. And there was an Indian themed Much Ado About Nothing. So all of this just tells you how much I care about Shakespeare and what an honor it is to have talked to Emma Smith and to Carol Rutter here with my dear friend Linda Bernstein. Thank you to all 3 wonderful professors, wonderful women for being with us. And a reminder of our sponsors, a big thank you to them. ProPublica was sponsored by Nidhi Sinha. She wanted to do a shout out to them. Congrats on ProPublica's latest Pulitzer that makes 6 in 12 years. Journalism that holds the powerful accountable. Please donate at propublica.org, propublica.org. And also to Pratham USA, they're raising money for education in India, and your money will be doubled if you go to prathamusa.org, prathamusa.org. And with that, I will just remind everyone we have a very special Mother's Day set of shows coming up. And I read the New York Times out loud every Sunday morning from 8:30 a.m. Eastern to 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. We have wonderful guests, and we are doing Thank a Mother on Mother's Day. And you can see me on the left with my mom, dressed as, I think she wanted me to be a little girl, but Shakespeare would have understood that. You have to play the role of a little girl if you're a boy sometimes, and you're not. And so we're going to do this wonderful tribute to moms. And so if you would like to contribute, you'd like to participate, half the money goes to Nick Kristoff's amazing effort on the Covid-19 Impact Initiative. Just email me, Sree@Sree.net, SREE@SREE.net. Thank you. We'll see you soon. I'm very, very grateful to all of you. Please email me, Sree@Sree.net, SREE@SREE.net. We're looking for 3 things: themes or suggestions for topics. We're looking for speakers. We're looking for sponsors, and we're grateful to have any or all of them. And self-nominations welcome, Sree@Sree.net. Thank you very much. And a big, big shout out to William Shakespeare on his 456th birthday, 456. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.